You love noticing when someone is performing, the calculated tone, the strategic humility, the coherence that feels a little too perfect. There's a quiet pleasure in spotting it, almost superior. I'm not like that. But you are. You adjust your vocabulary depending on who's listening. You measure how much truth is safe. You edit reactions before they escape, and you call it maturity. What bothers you about other people's masks isn't the falseness, it's the mirror. If their mask slips, yours might slip too. You don't hate performance. You hate being exposed inside it. Stay if that tightens something. You love noticing when someone is performing. The calculated tone, the strategic humility, the coherence that feels a little too perfect. There's a quiet pleasure in spotting it, almost superior. I'm not like that. But you are. You adjust your vocabulary depending on who's listening. You measure how much truth is safe. You edit reactions before they escape, and you call it maturity. What bothers you about other people's masks isn't the falseness, it's the mirror. If their mask slips, yours might slip too. You don't hate performance. You hate being exposed inside it. Stay if that tightens something. You are sitting in a meeting. Nothing dramatic is happening. Someone is speaking with measured confidence. Their tone is polished, their posture controlled, their sentences clean. You notice it immediately. The slight pause before answering, the way they adjust vocabulary depending on who is in the room, the laugh that comes half a second too late. You think, rehearsed. You scroll later that night. A public figure posts a carefully crafted apology, perfect lighting, neutral colors, the right amount of vulnerability. You think, performance. At dinner, a friend shares an opinion that shifts subtly depending on who reacts first. You catch the micro-adjustment, the recalibration. You think, mask. You are good at detecting it. The scripted tone, the moral positioning, the curated identity. And there is a small, quiet pleasure in noticing. A sense of clarity, of being less naive, of seeing through the stage set. Erving Goffman once described social life as a performance, where each of us manages impressions before an audience. Not as deception, but as structure. You recognize the structure in others. What you rarely examine is your role inside it. Because while you sit there observing the subtle choreography of someone else's image, you are also adjusting your own. You soften certain opinions depending on who is listening. You choose which story to tell and which one to omit. You measure how much honesty is safe. You call it context. You call it maturity. You call it knowing how the world works. But in that same meeting, you monitored your posture too. You filtered your words. You calculated the acceptable version of yourself. No one forced you. You participated. Social life runs on an unspoken agreement. We perform stability for each other. We reward coherence. We punish visible contradiction. We prefer smooth surfaces. When someone slips and the backstage leaks into the front stage, discomfort spreads fast. The room tightens. The comments sharpen. Not because we hate the mask, but because the crack reminds us of something we would rather not examine. And the moment you feel that discomfort rising in someone else, something inside you stiffens too. Because you know, if their mask can fall, so can yours. You feel it in your chest. That subtle tightening when someone appears too polished, too consistent, too strategically humble. You call it intuition. You say you can sense when something is off. And often you are right. The over-explained sincerity. The carefully timed vulnerability. The speech that feels engineered for applause. You notice. And when you notice, something else happens. You elevate yourself internally. Not loudly, not arrogantly, quietly. At least I'm not like that. It feels clean. You scroll past influencers speaking about authenticity while monetizing relatability. You watch executives preach values they quietly bend in private. You hear activists recalibrate their tone depending on the audience. You see the adjustments, and you condemn the inconsistency. But later, when you are the one in the spotlight of a small social moment, something subtle shifts inside you too. A colleague challenges you publicly. You feel the impulse to respond honestly. Fully. But you pause. You soften the edges. You choose diplomacy over precision. You choose safety over friction. You call it emotional intelligence. At a family gathering, a topic emerges that touches something raw. You know what you really think, but you measure the cost. You adapt the tone, you select the acceptable version of your stance, you call it maintaining peace. On social media, you consider posting something vulnerable. Then you hesitate. How will this be perceived? Will it disrupt the image people have of me? You adjust. You edit, you present, and you call it discernment. There is a double standard operating quietly. When others perform, you label it hypocrisy. When you perform, you label it adaptation. When others curate their image, you call it manipulation. When you do it, it becomes strategy. You demand authenticity from them. You protect stability for yourself, because admitting that you also manage impressions threatens something deeper. It threatens the image you hold about who you are. You believe you are transparent, direct, real. So when you detect artifice in someone else, it reassures you. It confirms your narrative. But the truth is less comfortable. You do not hate performance. You hate the idea that you are inside it too, and that discomfort is not about morality. It is about identity. If you admit that you are also adjusting constantly, then the version of yourself that feels solid begins to blur, and the ego does not tolerate blur well. So it does what it has always done. It points outward, it critiques, it analyzes, it exposes. Anything to avoid turning the same lens inward. Because if you did, you would have to admit something uncomfortable. You also have a front stage, a version of you designed for visibility. The composed voice, the controlled expressions, the curated coherence. And then there is the backstage, the fatigue, the contradictions, the thoughts you would never articulate in public, the impulses you edit before they reach daylight. You switch between them without noticing. At work, your posture straightens, your vocabulary sharpens, your humor becomes strategic. Alone at night, you loosen, your face softens, your doubts grow louder. With close friends, you reveal selected fragments of the backstage, enough to feel real, not enough to destabilize your position. In a new environment, you scan the room first. Who holds authority? What is acceptable here? How far can I go? You calibrate in seconds. This is not villainy. It is survival. Social spaces are not neutral. They reward predictability. They punish disruption. So you learn early how to manage impressions. You learn which parts of you generate approval, which parts generate silence, which parts generate subtle exclusion. And slowly, without declaring it consciously, you build a system. Front stage for public safety, backstage for private release. The problem is not that this structure exists. The problem begins when you forget you are inside it, when you start believing your own performance, when the role becomes so polished that even you cannot distinguish between what is presented and what is withheld. You have seen it happen to others. The executive who speaks about balance but never rests. The friend who advocates honesty but avoids confrontation. The public figure who champions vulnerability but edits every confession. You notice the cracks, but your own structure feels justified because you believe you are different. You believe your adjustments are reasonable, necessary, contextual. Yet every time you swallow a reaction to remain likable, something splits. Every time you exaggerate certainty to appear competent, something tightens. Every time you dilute your opinion to avoid friction, something retracts. Small fractures, almost invisible, but cumulative. And here is where the discomfort sharpens. If everyone is performing to some degree, then authenticity is not the absence of a mask. It is the awareness of it. And awareness costs stability. Because once you see the stage lights, you cannot pretend they are natural sunlight. Once you recognize the audience, you cannot claim you are alone. And once you admit you are managing impressions too, your moral distance from others collapses. You are no longer just the observer, you are part of the production, and this is where resistance usually appears. Because you can accept that society is theatrical. You can even admit that public figures curate their image. What is harder to accept is this. You do it too. You condemn public inconsistency. When someone's private behavior contradicts their public speech, you feel irritation. You call it integrity. But when your own behavior shifts depending on context, you call it nuance. When you soften your stance in one room and harden it in another, you call it reading the environment. When you avoid saying what you truly think to protect your reputation, you call it timing. The mechanism is identical. The label changes. You feel uncomfortable around people who seem artificial, too smooth, too rehearsed, too perfectly aligned with whatever audience they face. But you also know what happens when someone stops smoothing, when someone speaks without editing, when someone exposes contradiction openly. The room becomes tense, eyes narrow, whispers begin. You say you want authenticity, but when it disrupts comfort, you withdraw. Because authenticity is unstable, it reveals fractures, and fractures demand decisions. You expect others to be transparent, but you protect your own image carefully. You select which struggles are safe to reveal. You calibrate vulnerability. You share enough to appear human, not enough to lose authority. You criticize incoherence publicly. Yet when your own contradictions surface, you contextualize them. You explain. You justify. It was complicated. It was misunderstood. It was different. The mind is precise in defending self-image. Because admitting that you perform threatens a fantasy you depend on. The fantasy of being fundamentally authentic. If you are also adjusting constantly, then your sense of solidity weakens, and that feels dangerous. Because identity, once destabilized, does not return unchanged. So the ego protects itself in subtle ways. It highlights the artificiality of others. It emphasizes their calculated tone. It magnifies their inconsistencies. Projection is not cruelty. It is preservation. If you can locate hypocrisy outside, you can avoid confronting it inside. And this is the fracture line. You do not actually hate masks. You hate discovering that you need one. Because if the mask is structural, not exceptional, then authenticity is not a given. It is a negotiation. And negotiation implies compromise. The question becomes unavoidable. If you stopped adjusting completely, what would it cost you? Belonging? Stability? Influence? Would you still be welcomed in the same rooms? Would you still be perceived the same way? Would you still recognize yourself? Because the idea of dropping the mask sounds noble in theory. Radical honesty, complete transparency, no filtering. But in practice, the cost is immediate. You have seen what happens when someone stops calibrating. They speak too directly. They refuse to soften their edges. They expose contradictions without cushioning them. And the environment reacts. Not dramatically, subtly. Invitations decrease, conversations shorten, expressions cool. Someone whispers that they have changed, that they are intense now, difficult, uncomfortable. The system protects equilibrium. It prefers predictable roles. When you behave consistently, people relax. They know which version of you to expect. They know how to interact. But when you interrupt that predictability, something destabilizes. And destabilization spreads anxiety. So you learn. Not consciously, but through feedback. A raised eyebrow, a delayed response, a shift in tone. You adjust next time, you smooth, you calibrate again. Because belonging feels safer than friction. And this is the silent bargain. You maintain a coherent front stage. The group grants you stability. You avoid exposing the full backstage. The group avoids confronting theirs. No one says this out loud, but everyone understands it. Authenticity, when stripped of strategy, disrupts the choreography. It forces others to examine their own masks. And most people are not eager to do that. So when you criticize someone for being artificial, what you may actually be reacting to is their skill. They are better at stabilizing perception. They maintain their character without visible cracks. And that irritates you. Not because they are fake, but because they are effective. Effective at something you also practice. You just prefer to believe yours is different. The truth is quieter. You do not reject performance because it exists. You reject it because it reveals dependency. Dependency on approval, on coherence, on being seen a certain way. And if that dependency becomes visible, your identity feels less solid, less sovereign. less autonomous. So you keep adjusting, not because you love the mask, but because you understand the consequences of removing it too abruptly. And deep down, you are not sure you can afford that rupture. Because once you admit that you are managing impressions too, something irreversible happens. The moral hierarchy collapses. You are no longer the lucid observer diagnosing hypocrisy from a safe distance. You are implicated. Erving Goffman suggested that the self is not a fixed essence, but something continuously performed in interaction. Not fake, not pure, performed. If that is true, then the version of you that feels stable is not a core untouched by context. It is a negotiation repeated so often it feels natural. And this is where the discomfort sharpens into something harder to ignore. If identity is partly performance, then authenticity is not the absence of staging, it is the awareness of it. And awareness removes innocence. You can no longer say, "I'm just being myself," without questioning which self is speaking. The competent one, the agreeable one, the morally consistent one, or the one calibrated for this specific audience. This realization does not feel liberating, it feels destabilizing. Because if you are always adjusting, then who are you when no one is watching? And even more unsettling, are you ever completely unwatched? You internalize the audience. You anticipate reactions before they happen. You censor before being censored. The stage follows you into solitude. This is not a conspiracy. It is conditioning. You learned early that acceptance depends on coherence. So you built coherence, you refined it, you protected it, and now when someone else's mask slips, you feel a mixture of relief and irritation. Relief that it is not yours. Irritation that the illusion cracked. Because here is the fracture. You do not actually want a world without masks. You want a world where yours remains undetected. That sentence is uncomfortable. Sit with it. You do not hate deception. You hate exposure. And if you are still here, listening to this without turning away, then something in you recognizes the cost of this silent maintenance. If this tension resonates, not as accusation but as recognition, then stay. Not to fix it, but to see how deep the pact goes. Because once you see the pact, you cannot pretend you are outside of it. The performance survives because it is rewarded. We say we value truth, but we reward coherence. We say we want transparency, but we reward stability. Think about what shocks you. A public scandal does not disturb you because someone had a private flaw. It disturbs you because the front stage and backstage no longer match. The fracture is visible, and when it becomes visible, trust collapses. Not because imperfection exists, but because the illusion of alignment was broken. We do not punish flaws. We punish exposed inconsistency, and the same mechanism operates in smaller spaces, in friendships, in families, in workplaces. When someone reveals something that contradicts the version we were comfortable with, discomfort spreads. You feel it in yourself too. When someone changes unexpectedly, when someone drops their polished persona, when someone speaks from a place that disrupts the role you assigned them, you feel destabilized because the social contract was clear. Be who you said you were. Remain consistent. Maintain the image we built around you, and you do the same. You maintain your role so others can relax around you. You avoid drastic contradictions. You smooth transitions. You give people what they expect. This is not evil. It is collaborative. The mask is not imposed by tyrants. It is sustained by mutual preference. We prefer predictable identities. We prefer stable figures. We prefer narratives that do not require constant revision. If you are honest with yourself, you do not only tolerate performance, you rely on it. You rely on your boss being coherent, on your partner being consistent, on your friends behaving within recognizable boundaries. You rely on your own image being intact, because if every mask dissolved at once, interaction would become volatile, uncertain, raw. And most people do not want raw, they want reliable. If this recognition unsettles you, stay with it. Not because there is a solution waiting, but because the discomfort is honest. And if you have not already, consider subscribing, not for comfort, but for clarity. Because this channel does not promise relief, it exposes structure. And structure, once seen, does not disappear. You begin to notice it everywhere. The professional version of you that speaks in measured sentences. The private version that questions everything. The confident voice that others trust. The uncertain voice you rarely reveal. Two faces, not because you are deceitful, because you are adaptive. But adaptation, sustained for too long without awareness, fragments identity. You start to forget which reactions are spontaneous and which are strategic. You rehearse conversations in advance. You simulate responses. You pre-edit emotions before they surface. Over time, this creates exhaustion, not dramatic burnout, a quieter fatigue. The fatigue of impression management, the fatigue of coherence, the fatigue of holding a stable narrative about who you are. When the front stage becomes too rigid, the backstage grows heavier. Unspoken irritations accumulate, unexpressed contradictions tighten, moments of silence become dense. You tell yourself this is maturity, that adults regulate, that control is strength, and it is. Until control becomes constant surveillance, you monitor your tone, you monitor your expressions, you monitor how much of your doubt is allowed to show. At some point the question shifts, not, am I being honest? But, am I allowed to be? Because full exposure is rarely rewarded. People say they want transparency, but they prefer digestible transparency, measured vulnerability, curated confession, enough to feel human, not enough to destabilize hierarchy. This is why every powerful figure eventually reveals two faces. Not because corruption is inevitable, but because no one lives exclusively on the front stage. The backstage exists, whether acknowledged or not, and the more someone insists they are always authentic, the more fragile the claim becomes. There is a passage in The Forgotten Agreement by Luciana Santos that circles around this silent contract we make with ourselves. The contract to remain coherent even when coherence costs truth. It does not offer redemption, it simply exposes the agreement. Exposure does not free you automatically, it complicates you. Because now you cannot pretend you are a single, seamless identity. You are layered, negotiated, contextual. And the effort required to keep those layers aligned is not small. The cost is not that you wear a mask. The cost is that you must constantly maintain it. You must remember who you are supposed to be in each room. You must sustain the tone that matches your image. You must protect coherence even when your internal landscape shifts. And this is where the question stops being social. It becomes existential. If you are always negotiating presentation, where does your being rest? If every environment demands calibration, when do you stop calibrating? You criticize masks because they look calculated. But what unsettles you is something deeper. You recognize the calculation because you also perform it. You detect the rehearsal because you rehearse too. You don't hate masks. You hate discovering that you need one. Because the moment you admit that, the fantasy of effortless authenticity dissolves. And without that fantasy, you are left with something far more unstable. Responsibility. Responsibility for the image you project. Responsibility for the adjustments you justify. Responsibility for the silence you maintain when honesty would disturb the system. You are not a victim of the stage. You participate in it. You benefit from it. You protect it. And sometimes, you condemn others to avoid examining your own reflection. The silent pact continues because it works. It keeps relationships functional. It keeps hierarchies intact. It keeps identities coherent. But it also keeps something restrained, something unintegrated. Something that never fully steps forward because the lighting might expose too much. So here is the fracture you cannot easily ignore. If the mask protects your belonging, what protects your integrity? And if dropping it risks isolation, what does keeping it cost your sense of self? You prefer to believe in the mask. Because believing allows stability. Seeing requires choice. And choice, once conscious, cannot be undone. So now the question is no longer whether society performs. It does. The question is quieter, more personal. If you know you are performing too, why do you still pretend you are not? And what would remain of you if the audience disappeared? There is another layer you rarely examine, not just that you perform, but that you depend on others continuing to perform. Imagine someone in your life suddenly refusing the script. They stop being the reliable one. They stop being the calm one. They stop being the agreeable one. Not dramatically, simply honestly, you would feel the shift immediately. Conversations would lose rhythm. Predictability would collapse. You would not know which version of them you are interacting with, and something inside you would tighten. Because you rely on their mask to stabilize your own. When your partner plays their expected role, you know how to respond. When your boss remains composed, you know how to behave. When your friend stays consistent, you know how much to reveal. The choreography works because everyone keeps their part. Now imagine removing yours, not in rebellion, but in precision. You stop smoothing your tone. You stop exaggerating certainty. You stop performing competence when you feel doubt. Watch what happens. Some will call you authentic. Others will call you unstable. Not because you changed completely, but because the contract was altered without warning. The silent pact is fragile. It requires maintenance from all sides. You criticize powerful figures for having two faces, but power itself requires duality. Authority demands composure. Leadership demands coherence. Influence demands narrative control. The higher someone stands on the front stage, the more complex their backstage becomes. This is not corruption. It is structural tension. And you participate in smaller versions of the same tension every day. At work, in relationships, online. You manage perception because perception manages access. Access to opportunity, access to belonging, access to respect. So when you say you despise masks, ask yourself something more precise. Do you despise deception? Or do you despise losing control over how you are perceived? Because those are not the same. And the answer determines whether this discomfort is moral or existential. If you removed the audience, would you finally feel free? Or would you feel lost? Because perhaps the mask does not only protect you from others, perhaps it protects you from facing how fragmented you have become. Two faces are manageable, but a fractured center is not. And this is where the real tension lives. Not in hypocrisy, not in performance, but in the quiet realization that you have built an identity around being coherent in rooms that never asked who you were when the lights were off. You prefer to believe in the mask, because believing allows stability. Seeing requires choice. And once you see that you participate in the performance you condemn, you lose the comfort of innocence. So the question is no longer whether society performs. It does. The question is whether you are willing to admit that you benefit from the very illusion you criticize. And if the answer is yes, what are you going to do with that awareness?